Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I give you Christian responses to the skeptic worldview, and there are other videos including a series on the evidence for the resurrection and some other things. Currently going through I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. These are the contents of that book. I have published a commentary on the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms. If you find value in the work produced on this channel, please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing this published work. Pinnacles and Plateaus is the title. It's a commentary on the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms. The publisher is Zulon Press. Chapter 11, and I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, is the top 10 reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth. We've seen very powerful evidence that the major New Testament documents were written by eyewitnesses and their contemporaries within 15 to 40 years of the death of Jesus. Add to that the confirmation from non-Christian sources and archaeology, and we know beyond a reasonable doubt that the New Testament is based on historical fact. But how do we know the authors did not exaggerate or embellish what they say they saw? There are at least 10 reasons we can be confident that the New Testament writers did not play fast and loose with the facts. New Testament writers included embarrassing details about themselves. One of the ways historians can tell whether an author is telling the truth is to test what he says by the principle of embarrassment. This principle assumes that any details embarrassing to the author are probably true. Why? Because the tendency of most authors is to leave out anything that makes them look bad. How does the New Testament measure up to the principle of embarrassment? Let's put it this way. If you and your friends were concocting a story that you wanted to pass off as the truth, would you make yourselves look like dim-witted, uncaring, rebuked, doubting cowards? Of course not. But that's exactly what we find in the New Testament. The people who wrote down much of the New Testament are characters or friends of the characters in the story, and often they depict themselves as complete morons. They are dim-witted. Numerous times they fail to understand what Jesus is saying. An example of that is Mark chapter 9, verse 32, when it says that the disciples did not understand the saying of Jesus and were afraid to ask him. Likewise, in Luke 18:34, they understood none of these things. This saying was hidden from them, and they did not know the things which were spoken. So, disciples failing to understand Jesus. John chapter 12, verse 16, again, his disciples did not understand these things at first. Okay. In addition, the disciples appear uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus twice when he asks them to pray. That is the passage, I believe, in the Garden of Gethsemane, just prior to Jesus' arrest. And you see there in the passage that's quoted from the book of Mark, in verse 37 and in verse 40, it says that Jesus came and found his disciples sleeping. The New Testament writers later believe that Jesus is the God-man, yet they admit they twice fell asleep on him in his greatest hour of need. Moreover, his disciples make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial, but record that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the very court that had sentenced Jesus to die. The disciples are rebuked. Jesus called Peter Satan when Peter said that Jesus shouldn't die. Jesus turned around and rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, because you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." Paul rebukes Peter for being wrong about a theological issue in Galatians chapter 2. Peter came to Antioch, and Paul withstood Peter to the face because he was to be blamed. Now keep in mind that Peter is one of the pillars of the early church, and Paul is writing in Scripture that Peter was wrong about something. The disciples were cowards. The disciples, all but one of the disciples, hid when Jesus went to the cross. Peter even denies Jesus 3 times after explicitly promising never to disown him in Matthew chapter 20, 6, verses 33 through 35. We read that passage. He says, after Jesus predicts, Peter is adamant that he, even if everyone stumbles because of Jesus, that he never will. And then Jesus says, well, Peter, no, you're wrong. Even tonight, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter says, I will die with you before I will deny you. And the rest of the disciples agreed with Peter. Meanwhile, as the men are hiding for fear of the Jews, the brave women stand by Jesus and are the first to discover the empty tomb. The disciples are doubters. Despite being taught several times that Jesus would rise from the dead, the disciples doubt when they hear of his resurrection. In John chapter 2, the Jews answered and said to Jesus, "What sign do you show us since you do these things?" And this was the miracle at Cana with the water and wine, if I'm not mistaken. And Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple." In other words, kill me, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. He's predicting his resurrection. But the Jews misunderstood. They thought he was talking about the literal temple. But then John records that after Jesus rose, his disciples remembered him saying this to the Pharisees, and they believed the scripture. So it took them all, like, if this miracle took place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry and his ministry lasted 3.5 years, then it took 3 years essentially for them to believe this. Okay, John chapter 3, verses 14 to 18. This is where Jesus refers back to the story of Moses lifting up the serpent in the wilderness and comparing that to himself, saying that he too, like that serpent, would need to be lifted up, and that whoever believes in him would not perish but have everlasting life. And then, of course, the great verse that many Christians have memorized: "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life." And he's talking about if you believe that glorious truth, then you'll have everlasting life. And it's unbelief that God condemns, and people are condemned for their unbelief. Matthew chapter 12, beginning in verse 39, "But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Men of Nineveh will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here." So Jesus is drawing a parallel between Jonah and his 3 days in the fish, saying that he would die and 3 days later he would rise from the dead. Matthew 17, verse 9, "Now as they came down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, Tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man has risen from the dead." This was after Jesus' transfiguration on the mountain, and he said, "Don't tell anybody that you saw me get transfigured until after I've risen from the dead." So he's predicting his resurrection to his disciples. Matthew 17, 22 to 23 is predicting his resurrection again, saying they will kill him, and the 3rd day he'll be raised up. And the disciples were sorrowful because they heard the part about him being killed, but not the part about him being raised up, apparently. The disciples are doubters. Let's see. They doubt even after they saw him risen. Some of them, at least Thomas did, doubt when he saw him, and many, when they first heard it before they saw him, doubted. Matthew 28:17, "When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted." That's the Great Commission chapter. Think about this. If you were a New Testament writer, would you include these embarrassing details if you were making up a story? Would you want people to think that they didn't believe Jesus? No, if you were making up the story, you would embellish it and try to make it seem perfect, such that everybody had bold, uncompromising faith if you were going to make it up. But since the New Testament writers wanted to show that this was a true story, they didn't embellish the details. would you write down that one of your primary leaders was called Satan by Jesus? That one who was called Satan denied the Lord 3 times, that he hid during the crucifixion and was later corrected on a theological issue? Would you want to show the weakness of his followers if you were writing these things down? Would you go out of your way to show the weakness? Would you depict yourselves as uncaring, bumbling cowards? And would you show the women as the brave ones who stood by Jesus and later discovered the empty tomb? And the women's testimony wouldn't even be admissible in a court of law in that day. Would you admit that some of you, even the 11 remaining disciples, doubted the very Son of God after he'd proven himself risen to all of you? Of course you wouldn't. So what do you think the New Testament writers would have done if they were making up a story? You know perfectly well. They would have left out their ineptness. They would have made themselves look better than they really were. They would have left out their cowardice. They would have made themselves look bold. They would have left out the rebuke. They would have made themselves look as good as possible. They would have left out the denials, because they would want to show perfect faith rather than the weak or even non-existent faith. They would leave out the theological problems because they wouldn't want to show the fighting within the church. And they would depict themselves as bold believers who stood by Jesus through it all and who confidently marched down to the tomb on Sunday morning right through the elite Roman guards to find the risen Jesus waiting to congratulate them on their great faith. If you were the New Testament writers and you wanted to make this up, that's how you would do it. You'd want to paint yourself in as positive a light as possible. The men who wrote it would also say that they declared the risen Jesus to the women who were the ones hiding for fear of the Jews. They wouldn't want to make the women look better than themselves. And of course, if the story was a concoction, no disciple at any time would have been portrayed as doubting, especially after Jesus had risen. In short, we don't have enough faith to believe that the New Testament writers included all those embarrassing details in a made-up story. The best explanation is that they really were telling the truth, warts and all. Number 2, the New Testament writers included embarrassing details and difficult sayings of Jesus. The New Testament writers are also honest about Jesus. Not only do they record self-incriminating details about themselves, they also record embarrassing details about their leader, Jesus, that seem to place him in a bad light. Jesus is considered out of his mind by his mother and his brothers, his own family, who came to seize him in order to take him home. In Mark chapter 3, verse 21, when his own people heard about this, they went out and laid hold of him, for they said, "He is out of his mind." Jesus was not believed by his own brothers. His own people said he's out of his mind. Jesus was thought to be a deceiver. It was said of him that he deceives the people. Some said that he was good, while others said he deceives the people. Jesus was deserted by many of his own followers. From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. Jesus turned off the Jews who had believed in him to the point that they wanted to stone him. And they spoke the words, he spoke the words, many believed in him. And Jesus said to the Jews who believe in him, "If you abide in my word, you're my disciples indeed." And then later on in that chapter, they took up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. They took up stones to throw at him because they wanted to kill him. He was called a drunkard. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, "Look, a glutton, a winebibber, and a friend of tax collectors and sinners." He was called a drunkard. Okay. He was called demon-possessed. The scribe said that he has Beelzebub, and by the ruler of demons he cast out demons. The people answered and said to Jesus that Jesus has a demon when he suggested that they were trying to kill him. The Jews answered and said to Jesus, "Do we not say rightly that you are Samaritan and have a demon?" So again, he's accused of being demon-possessed. He's called a madman. He has a demon and is mad. John chapter 10. He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute. In Luke chapter 7, when she breaks the alabaster flask with the fragrant oil and spills the oil pours the oil on his feet and wipes his feet with her hair and her tears. She's a prostitute, and so that's causing people to have a negative reaction towards him because of his association in this setting with that prostitute. He's crucified by the Jews and Romans, despite the fact that anyone who's hung on a tree is cursed by God. In Deuteronomy 21:23, it says, "He who's hanged is accursed of God." In Galatians 3:13, it says, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." This is certainly not a list of events and qualities the New Testament writers would choose if they were trying to depict Jesus as the perfect, sinless God-man. Nor are these the qualities congruent with the Jewish expectation that the Messiah would come to free them from political oppression. In fact, according to their own Bible, at the time, the Old Testament, Jesus was cursed by God for being hanged on a tree. The best explanation for these embarrassing details is that they actually occurred, and the New Testament writers are telling the truth. In addition to embarrassing details, there are several difficult sayings attributed to Jesus that the New Testament writers would not have included if they were making up a story about Jesus being God. For example, according to the New Testament, Jesus declares the Father is greater than he. In John chapter 14, verse 28, he says, "I'm going to the Father, for my Father is greater than I." This seems to predict incorrectly that he's coming back to earth within a generation, or in a different passage, in Matthew 24, verse 34. He says, "This generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." It looked like he looked like he was going to be coming back sooner. Then he says about his second coming that no one knows the time, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son. He looks like he's contradicting himself in that spot, but he wasn't. In Matthew 24:36, he says, "Only the Father knows when the end's coming, not the Son, not the angels, only the Father." He seems to deny his own deity, by asking the rich young ruler his identity. He says, "Why do you call me good?" When he's talking to the rich young ruler, he says, no one is good but one, that is God." He wasn't denying his deity. I think he was trying to elicit the response from the rich young ruler for the rich young ruler to admit that he is who he is. He is seen cursing a fig tree for not having figs when it wasn't even the season for figs. I mean, on the surface, that looks like a rather silly thing for someone to do, but he had the perfect reason for everything, so it wasn't. He was trying to show a lesson. So he went to the fig tree that had leaves, but there were no figs on it, just leaves. Okay, Mark 6, verse 5, he could do no mighty. When he went to his hometown, he couldn't do miracles except to heal a few sick people. I think that was because of the weak faith of the people there. If the New Testament writers wanted to prove to everyone that Jesus was God, then why did they leave in these difficult sayings that seemed to argue against his deity? Moreover, Jesus makes what seems to be a completely morbid claim. "I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." After this hard saying, Jesus says, "From this time many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him." Since the New Testament writers would not invent this strange saying and unfavorable reaction, it must be authentic, because they're not going to make it up, because it's going to make Jesus look bad, it's going to make them look bad. While there are reasonable explanations for these difficult sayings, it doesn't make sense that the New Testament writers would leave them in if they were trying to pass off a lie as the truth. In fact, it doesn't make sense that they would make up a character anything like Jesus. A weak and dying Messiah, a sacrificial lamb, is the very antithesis of a man-made hero. Again, the best explanation is that the New Testament writers were not playing fast and loose with the facts, but were extremely accurate in recording exactly what Jesus said and did. The New Testament writers, number 3, left in demanding sayings of Jesus. If the New Testament writers were making up a story, they certainly didn't make up a story that made life easier for them. This Jesus had some very demanding standards. The Sermon on the Mount, for instance, does not appear to be a human invention. In Matthew 5:28, Jesus said, "If anyone looks at a woman lustfully, has already committed adultery with her in his heart." In Matthew 5:32, he says, if a man divorces his wife for any reason other than sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery, and if whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. These are Jesus demanding standards, but I tell you in Matthew 5:39 to 42, also the Sermon on the Mount, I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him also have your cloak. Whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Judge not that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. All these commands are difficult and impossible for human beings to keep, and seem to go against the natural best interests of the men who wrote them down. They certainly are contrary to the desires of many today who want a religion of spirituality that has no moral demands. Consider the extremity and undesirable implications of these commands. If thinking about sin is sinful, then everyone, including the New Testament writers, is guilty. To set such stringent standards for divorce and remarriage does not appear to be in the earthly best interests of the men who recorded the saying. To not resist the insults of an evil person is to resist our basic human instincts. It also sets up an inconvenient standard of behavior for the apostles who were undergoing persecution when this saying was written down. To pray for our enemies goes well beyond any ethic ever uttered and commands kindness where enmity is natural. To not accumulate financial wealth contradicts our deepest desires for temporal security. To be perfect is an unattainable request for fallible human beings. To not judge unless our own lives are in order counters our natural tendency to point out faults in others while ignoring our own. These commands clearly are not the commands that people would impose on themselves. Who can live up to such standards? Not you, not me, not anyone else, only a perfect person. None of us meets that requirement. Perhaps that's exactly the point. Number 4, New Testament writers carefully distinguish Jesus' words from their own. Even though quotation marks did not exist in first century Greek, the New Testament writers distinguish Jesus' words very clearly. Most red letter editions of Bibles are identical, illustrating how easy the New Testament writers made it to see what Jesus said and what he didn't say. Why do we cite this as evidence of their trustworthiness? Because it would have been very easy for the New Testament writers to solve first-century theological disputes by putting words in Jesus' mouth. After all, if you were making up the Christianity story and trying to pass it off as the truth, wouldn't you simply make up more quotes from Jesus to convince stubborn people to see things your way? Think how convenient it would have been for them to end all debate on controversial issues such as circumcision, obeying the law of Moses, speaking in tongues, women in the church, and so forth by merely making up quotes from Jesus. Despite unending frustration with some early believers, the New Testament writers never do that. Instead of pulling rank in this way, the New Testament writers seem to stay true to what Jesus said and didn't say. Paul, the man who wrote nearly half the New Testament books, at least 13 of the 27, and dealt with most of the controversial problems in the church, never pulls rank. He quotes Jesus just a few times. And on one of those occasions, he goes out of his way to explicitly distinguish his own words from those of Jesus. Here that is, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 to 12. Paul says, "Now to the married, I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say if any brother has a wife who does not believe and she's willing to live with him, let him not divorce her." Why would Paul have been so careful if he were not telling the truth? Again, the best explanation for the accuracy of the New Testament writers is that they were telling the truth. Number 5. New Testament writers include events related to the resurrection that they would not have invented. In addition to the inclusion of embarrassing details regarding themselves and Jesus, the New Testament writers record events related to the resurrection that they would not have inserted if they had invented the story. These include the burial of Jesus, the first witnesses, the conversion of priests, the explanation of the Jews. So now we're going to look at the burial of Jesus. We're going to look at the 4 of these. First is the burial of Jesus. The New Testament writers record that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, a Sanhedrin member, which was the Jewish ruling council that had sentenced Jesus to die for blasphemy. This is not an event that they would have made up. Considering the bitterness some Christians harbored against the Jewish authorities, why would they put a member of the Sanhedrin in such a favorable light? And why would they put Jesus in the tomb of a Jewish authority? For if Joseph didn't really bury Jesus, the story would have been easily exposed as fraudulent by the Jewish enemies of Christianity. Yes, if Joseph of Arimathea did not really bury Jesus, the story would have been easily exposed as fraudulent by the Jewish enemies of Christianity. But the Jews never denied the story, and no alternative story has ever been found. All 4 Gospels. Now, after the burial of Jesus, we're going to look at the first witnesses. All 4 Gospels say that the women were the first witnesses of the empty tomb and the first to learn of the resurrection. One of the women was Mary Magdalene, who Luke admits had been demon-possessed. Luke chapter 8, verse 2, certain women who'd been healed of evil spirits and infirmities Mary called Magdalene, out of whom had come 7 demons. This would never be inserted in a made-up story. Not only would a once demon-possessed person make a questionable witness, but women in general were not considered reliable witnesses in that first-century culture. In fact, a woman's testimony carried no weight in a court of law. So, if you were making up a resurrection story in the first century, you would avoid women witnesses and make yourselves, the brave men, the first ones to discover the empty tomb and the risen Jesus. Citing the testimony of women, especially demon-possessed women, would only hurt your attempt to pass off the lie as the truth. Number 5. The conversion of priests. Am I still on number 5? Yes, I'm still on number 5. In addition to the first witnesses, you have the conversion of priests. Why didn't the risen Jesus appear to the Pharisees is a popular question asked by skeptics. The answer might be that it wasn't necessary for Jesus to appear to the Pharisees. This is often overlooked, but many priests in Jerusalem became believers. Luke writes, then the word of God spread, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were obedient to the faith. These priests eventually initiated a controversy that took place later in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem church. Some during a council meeting between Peter, Paul, James, and other elders, some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to obey the law of Moses. The council resolved the issue, but our main point here is that Luke would not have included these details if they were fiction. Why not? Because everyone would have known Luke was a fraud if there were not significant converts from the ranks of the Pharisees. Theophilus and other first-century readers would have known, or could have easily found out, if such converts existed. Obviously, the Pharisees would have known too. Why would Luke give them an easy way of exposing his lies? After all, if you try to pass off a lie as the truth, you don't make it easy for your enemies to expose your story. Pharisee conversion and Joseph of Arimathea were 2 unnecessary details that, if untrue, would have completely blown Luke's cover. And the Joseph story would have blown the cover not only of Luke, but of every other gospel writer as well, because they include the same burial story. Okay, in addition to the conversion of the priests, we've got the explanation of the Jews. The Jewish explanation for the empty tomb is recorded in the last chapter of Matthew's Gospel. In verses 11 to 15, it says that the chief priests assembled with the elders, and they gave money to the soldiers, and the Jewish leaders told the soldiers to tell them that his disciples came at night and stole him away while he slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and make you secure. So they took the money and did as they were instructed. And the saying was common among the Jews until Matthew's Gospel was written. Notice that Matthew makes it very clear that his readers already know about this Jewish explanation for the empty tomb because the story's been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. So Matthew wasn't hiding that, wasn't inserting a detail that wasn't already well known. That means Matthew's readers, and certainly the Jews themselves, would know whether or not he was telling the truth, because that was a well-known story at the time. If Matthew was making up the empty tomb story, then why would he give his readers such an easy way to expose his lies? Obviously, if Matthew were making that up, somebody could have easily come and provided evidence to discount that story. But that apparently didn't happen. The only plausible explanation is that the tomb must have really been empty, and that the Jewish enemies of Christianity must have really been circulating that specific explanation for the empty tomb. In fact, Justin Martyr and Tertullian, writing in AD 150 and 200 respectively, claim that the Jewish authorities continued to offer this theft story throughout the 2nd century. Wow. We'll discuss the problems with this theory in the next chapter. Number 6, the New Testament writers include more than 30 historically confirmed people in their writings. This is a critical point that bears repeating. The New Testament documents cannot have been invented because they contain too many historically confirmed characters. The New Testament writers would have blown their credibility with their contemporary audiences by implicating real people in a fictional story, especially people of great notoriety and power. There's no way the New Testament writers could have gotten away with writing outright lies about Pilate, Caiaphas, Festus, Felix, and the entire Herodian bloodline. Somebody would have exposed them for falsely implicating these people in events that never occurred. The New Testament writers knew this, and would not have included so many prominent real people in a fictional story that was intended to deceive. Again, the best explanation is that the New Testament writers accurately recorded what they saw. Number 7. New Testament writers include divergent details. Critics are quick to cite apparent contradictory gospel accounts as evidence that the gospels can't be trusted for accurate information. For example, Matthew says there was one angel at the tomb of Jesus, while John mentions 2. There's Matthew's mention of 1 in Matthew 28:5, and there's John's mention of 2 in John 20, verse 12. Isn't this a contradiction that blows the credibility of these accounts? No. Exactly the opposite is true. Divergent details actually strengthen the case that these are eyewitness accounts. How so? First, let's point out that the angel accounts are not contradictory. Matthew does not say that there was only one angel at the tomb. The critic has to add a word to Matthew's account to make it contradict John's. But why did Matthew mention only one if 2 angels were really there? For the same reason, 2 different newspaper reporters covering the same event choose to include different details in their stories. 2 independent eyewitnesses rarely see all the same details and will never describe an event in exactly the same words. They'll record the same major event, that Jesus rose from the dead, but may differ on the details. How many angels were in his tomb? In fact, when a judge hears 2 witnesses giving the exact same word-for-word testimony, what does that judge rightly assume? That judge rightly assumes that the witnesses colluded, that they got together beforehand to make their stories agree. Okay, so it's perfectly reasonable that Matthew and John differ. They are both recording eyewitness testimony. Maybe Matthew mentioned only the angel that spoke, while John described how many angels Mary saw. Or maybe one angel was more prominent than the other. We don't know for sure. We just know that such differences are common among eyewitnesses. In light of the numerous divergent details in the New Testament, it's clear that the New Testament writers didn't get together to smooth out their testimonies. That means they certainly weren't trying to pass off a lie as the truth. For if they were making up the New Testament story, they would have gotten together to make sure they were consistent in every detail. Such harmonization clearly didn't happen, and this confirms the genuine eyewitness nature of the New Testament and the independence of each writer. Ironically, it's not the New Testament that's contradictory, it's the critics. On the one hand, the critics claim that the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are too uniform to be independent sources. On the other hand, they claim that they're too divergent to be telling the truth. So which are they? Are they too uniform or too divergent? Actually, we think they're a perfect blend of both. Namely, they are both sufficiently uniform and sufficiently divergent, but not too much so, precisely because they are independent eyewitness accounts of the same event. Because they are independent eyewitness accounts of the same event, they are uniform and and Divergent. You would expect that in eyewitness accounts from multiple people of the same events. One would expect to see the same major facts and different minor details in 3 independent news stories about the same event. If you don't believe us, then log on to the internet today and look at 3 independent stories about a particular event in the news. Pick one from the Associated Press, one from Reuters, and maybe another from UPI or an independent reporter. Each story will contain some of the same major facts, but may include different minor details. In most cases, the account will be complementary rather than contradictory. For example, if 3 news sources carry a story about a presidential visit to a foreign country, the stories will all properly identify the country, but they may emphasize different minor details. If one account says the president visited the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and if another account says the president visited the Prime Minister in a room with marble pillars, are those 2 accounts complementary or contradictory? They're complementary. The second account doesn't contradict the first, it just adds to it. In the same way, all the Gospels agree on the same major fact, that Jesus rose from the dead. They just have different complementary details. And even if one could find some minor details between the Gospels that are flatly contradictory, that wouldn't prove the resurrection is fiction. It may present a problem for the doctrine that the Bible is without any minor error, but it wouldn't mean the major event didn't happen. Simon Greenleaf, at the bottom left there, the Harvard law professor who wrote the standard study on what constitutes legal evidence, credited his own conversion to Christianity as having come from his careful examination of the gospel witnesses. He was quoted in the evidence that demands a verdict on the evidence for the resurrection, if I remember correctly. So, Greenleaf, Harvard law professor, wrote the standard study on what constitutes legal evidence, credited his own conversion to Christianity as having come from his careful examination of the gospel witnesses. If anyone knew the characteristics of general eyewitness testimony, it was Simon Greenleaf. He concluded that the 4 Gospels would have been received in evidence in any court of justice without the slightest hesitation. The bottom line is this: agreement on the major points and divergence on the minor details is the nature of eyewitness testimony. And this is the very nature of the New Testament documents. Number 8. New Testament writers challenge their readers to check out verifiable facts, even facts about miracles. We've already seen some of the claims of the accuracy of the New Testament writers. We've already seen some of the claims of accuracy the New Testament writers make to the recipients of their documents. These include Luke's overt assertion of accuracy to Theophilus, Peter's claim that they did not follow cleverly devised tales but were eyewitnesses to Christ's majesty, Paul's bold declaration to Festus and King Agrippa about the resurrected Christ, and Paul's restatement of an early creed that identified more than 500 eyewitnesses of the risen Christ. In addition, Paul makes another claim to the Corinthians that he wouldn't have made unless he was telling the truth. In his second letter to the Corinthians, Paul declares that he previously performed miracles for them. Speaking of his own qualifications as an apostle, someone who speaks for God, Paul reminds the Corinthians, "Truly the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you with all perseverance in signs and wonders and mighty deeds." Now, why would Paul write this to the Corinthians unless he really had done miracles for them? He would have destroyed his credibility completely by asking them to remember miracles that he never did for them. The only plausible conclusion is that Paul really was an apostle from God, that Paul therefore really had the ability to confirm his apostleship by performing miracles, and that Paul displayed this miracle-performing ability openly to the Corinthians. Number 9. New Testament writers describe miracles like other historical events with simple, unembellished accounts. Embellished and extravagant details are strong signs that a historical account has legendary elements. For example, there's a legendary account of Christ's resurrection that was written more than 100 years after the actual event. It's from the apocryphal forgery known as the Gospel of Peter, and it goes like this. Early in the morning, as the Sabbath dawned, there came a large crowd from Jerusalem and the surrounding areas to see the sealed tomb. But during the night, before the Lord's day dawned, as the soldiers were keeping guard 2 by 2 in every watch, there came a great sound in the sky, and they saw the heavens opened and 2 men descending, shining with a great light, and they drew near to the tomb. The stone which had been set on the door rolled away by itself and moved to one side, and the tomb was opened, and both the young men went in. Now when these soldiers saw that, they woke up the centurion and the elders, for they also were there keeping watch. While they were telling them the things which they had seen, they saw 3 men come out of the tomb, 2 of them sustaining the other one, and a cross following after them. The heads of the 2 they saw had heads that reached up to heaven, and they heard a voice out of the heavens saying, "Have you preached unto them that sleep?" The answer that was heard from the cross was, "Yes." Wow. Now that's how I would have written it if I were making up or embellishing the resurrection story. We see large crowds, moving stones, heads of men stretching to heaven and beyond, and we even see a walking and talking cross. How exciting! How embellished. The New Testament resurrection accounts contain nothing like this. The Gospels give matter-of-fact, almost bland descriptions of the resurrection. Mark describes what the women saw this way. Mark chapter 16, verses 4 to 8. But when they looked up, they saw the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him, but go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee, and there you'll see him. And he said to you." And as he said to you, so they went out publicly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Luke's description is almost as stark. Luke 24, 2 to 8. But they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. Then they went in and did not find the body of the Lord Jesus, and it happened as they were greatly perplexed about this, that behold, 2 men stood by them in shining garments. Then, as they were afraid, they bowed their faces to the earth and said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He's not here. He's risen. Or he's not here, but is risen. Remember how he spoke to you when he was still in Galilee, saying, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the 3rd day rise again." And they remembered his words. John, in his gospel, briefly mentions Mary Magdalene discovering the empty tomb, adds the experience of Peter and John, and then returns to Mary outside the tomb. But they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, and they went in and did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. And it happened as they were greatly perplexed about this, that behold, 2 men stood by them in shining garments. Then as they were afraid, bowed their faces to the earth and said to them, "Who do you seek? Why do you seek the living among the dead?" Let's see. Okay, John briefly mentions Mary discovering the tomb. As the experience of Peter and John returns to Mary outside the tomb, nothing appears embellished. John chapter 20, verses 1 to 12. In the interest of time, I'll just say you can pause the video and read the verses if you want. John's account then describes Jesus' appearance to Mary. The New Testament resurrection accounts do not contain embellished details. They give matter-of-fact, bland descriptions. Matthew's account of the women is more dramatic, but contains nothing bizarre, like long heads or walking and talking crosses found in the Gospel of Peter. Describing the earthquake. The women are there, and the angel says to the women, "Don't be afraid." But the resurrection is the central event in Christianity. As Paul wrote, "If Christ has not risen, your faith is futile and you're still in your sins." If the resurrection were a made-up story designed to convince skeptics, then the New Testament writers certainly would have made their accounts longer with more detail. Moreover, they probably would have said they witnessed Jesus physically rising from the dead. Instead, they get to the tomb after he's risen and make no attempt to dress up their discovery with verbose descriptions or cartoonish talking crosses. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't even say anything about the dramatic theological implications of the resurrection, and John reports those implications in just 1 sentence. The point about the theological restraint of the gospel writers deserves amplification. It indicates that the gospel writers were concerned about getting history correct, not inventing some kind of new theology. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright makes the astute observation that neither going to heaven when you die, life after death, eternal life, nor even the resurrection of Christ of all people is so much as mentioned in the 4 canonical resurrection stories. If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wanted to tell stories whose import was Jesus is risen, therefore you will be too, they have done a remarkably bad job of it. This is almost shocking when you think about it. If you go to most evangelical church services today, the constant emphasis is to come to Jesus to get saved. That's certainly taught in the whole of the New Testament, but it's hardly mentioned in the Gospels. Why? Because the Gospel writers were writing history, not mere theology. Of course, New Testament history has dramatic implications on theology, but those implications are drawn out in other New Testament writings, namely the epistles. It would have been easy for the Gospel writers to interject the theological implications of every historical event, but they did not. They were eyewitnesses who were writing history, not fiction writers or proselytizing theologians. Their level-headedness is also on display with the other miracles they record. The 35 other miracles attributed to Jesus in the Gospels are described as if from reporters, not wild-eyed preachers. The Gospel writers don't offer flamboyant descriptions or fire and brimstone commentary, just the facts. Number 10, the last one. New Testament writers abandoned their long-held sacred beliefs and practices, adopted new ones, and did not deny their testimony under persecution or threat of death. The New Testament writers don't just say that Jesus performed miracles and rose from the dead. They actually back up that testimony with dramatic action. First, virtually overnight, they abandon many of their long-held sacred beliefs and practices. Among the 1,500-year-old plus institutions they give up are the following: the animal sacrifice system, which was replaced forever by Christ's perfect sacrifice, the binding supremacy of the law of Moses. They say it's powerless because of the sinless life of Christ. Strict monotheism. They now worship Jesus, the God-man, despite the fact that their most cherished belief has been, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and man worship was always considered blasphemy and punishable by death. The Sabbath. They no longer observe the Sabbath, even though they've always believed that breaking the Sabbath was punishable by death. They believed in a conquering Messiah. Jesus is the opposite of a conquering Messiah. He's a sacrificial lamb, at least he was on his first visit. And that's not just the New Testament writers who do this. Thousands of Jerusalem Jews, including Pharisee priests, convert to Christianity and join New Testament writers in abandoning these treasured beliefs and practices. J.P. Moreland helps us understand the magnitude of these devout Jews giving up their established institutions virtually overnight. Here's the J.P. Moreland quote. The Jewish people believed that these institutions were entrusted to them by God. They believed that to abandon these institutions would be to risk their souls being damned to hell after death. Now, a rabbi named Jesus appears from a lower class region. He teaches for 3 years, gathers a following of lower and middle class people, gets in trouble with the authorities, and gets crucified along with 30,000 other Jewish men who were executed during this time period. But 5 weeks after he's crucified, over 10,000 Jews are following him and claiming that he is the initiator of a new religion. And get this, they're willing to give up or alter all 5 of the social institutions that they've been taught since childhood, have such importance both sociologically and theologically. Something very big was going on. End quote from J.P. Moreland. How do you explain these monumental shifts if the New Testament writers were making up a story? How do you explain them if the resurrection did not occur? Second, not only do these new believers abandon their long-held beliefs and practices, they also adopt some radical new ones. These include Sunday, a work day, as the new day of worship. These include baptism as a new sign that one was a partaker of the new covenant, as circumcision was a sign of the old covenant. These include communion as an act of remembrance of Christ's sacrifice for their sins. Communion is especially inexplicable unless the resurrection is true. Why would Jews make up a practice where they symbolically eat the body and drink the blood of Jesus? The following table sums up the dramatic changes brought about by their resurrection. Before the resurrection and after the resurrection. Before the resurrection, there was animal sacrifice. After the resurrection, animal sacrifice is unnecessary because of Christ's sacrifice. Before the resurrection, the law of Moses was binding. After the resurrection, the law of Moses was not binding because Christ fulfilled it. Before the resurrection, there was strict monotheism. After the resurrection, you had the Trinity. Before the resurrection, there was Sabbath worship. But after the resurrection, Sunday, the Lord's Day, replaced the Sabbath. Before the resurrection, you had a conquering Messiah. After the resurrection, you had a sacrificial Messiah. Before the resurrection, you had circumcision. After the resurrection, you have baptism and communion. Finally, in addition to abandoning long-held sacred institutions and adopting new ones, New Testament writers suffered persecution and death when they could have saved themselves by recanting. If they'd made up the resurrection story, they certainly would have said so when they were about to be crucified, as Peter was, stoned as James was, or beheaded as Paul was. But no one recanted. 11 out of the 12 were martyred for their faith. The only survivor was John, who was exiled to the Greek island of Patmos. Why would they die for a known lie? Number 10. Chuck Colson, former aide of President Nixon and founder of Prison Fellowship, went to prison over the Watergate scandal. Watergate, comparing his experience to that of the apostles, Chuck Colson writes, quote, Watergate involved a conspiracy to cover up, perpetuated by the closest aides of the President of the United States, the most powerful men in America who were intensely loyal to their president. But none of them, John Dean, turned state's evidence, that is, testified against Nixon, as he put it, to save his own skin, and he did so only 2 weeks after informing the president about what was really going on. 2 weeks. The real cover-up, the lie, could only be held together for 2 weeks, then everybody else jumped ship in order to save themselves. Now, the fact is that all those around the president were facing was embarrassment, maybe prison. Nobody's life was at stake. But what about the disciples? 12 powerless men, peasants really, were facing not just embarrassment or political disgrace, but beatings, stonings, and execution. Every single one of the disciples insisted to their dying breaths that they had physically seen Jesus bodily raised from the dead. Don't you think that one of those apostles would have cracked before being beheaded or stoned? That one of them would have made a deal with the authorities? None did. Colson is right. The apostles surely would have cracked to save themselves. Peter had already denied Jesus 3 times before the resurrection in order to save his skin. He surely would have denied him after the resurrection if the story had turned out to be a hoax. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia pointed out the absurdity of those who doubt the historicity of the New Testament. In a remark biting with sarcasm against modern-day intellectuals, Justice Scalia stated exactly what we've been saying regarding the motives of the New Testament writers. Namely, since the New Testament writers had nothing to gain and everything to lose, we ought to believe what they say about the resurrection. Justice Scalia declared, quote, It's not irrational to accept the testimony of eyewitnesses who had nothing to gain. The worldly wise do not believe in the resurrection of the dead. So everything from Easter morning to the Ascension had to be made up by the groveling enthusiasts as part of their plan to get themselves martyred. End quote. Yeah, biting with sarcasm. Yeah, so the disciples had to make it up because they were trying to get killed. Right. Very sarcastic. Scalia and Colson are absolutely right. There is no reason to doubt and every reason to believe the New Testament accounts. While many people will die for a lie that they think is the truth, no sane person will die for what they know is a lie. The New Testament writers and other apostles knew for sure that Jesus had resurrected, and they demonstrated that knowledge with their own blood. What more could eyewitnesses do to prove that they're telling the truth? What about Muslim martyrs? Hold on, the skeptic might object. We see people dying for their faith every day. I've heard that objection personally, from what I recall. Do you ever watch the news? There's a suicide bomber nearly every week in the Middle East. Have you forgotten about 9/11 already? The hijackers were doing it for Allah. What does martyrdom prove? Does it prove that Islam is true too? Do Muslim martyrs prove that Islam is true? Not at all. There are some similarities, but there's one critical difference between New Testament martyrs and those of today. One similarity shared by all martyrs is sincerity. Whether you're talking about Christians, Muslims, kamikaze pilots, or suicide cult followers, everyone agrees that martyrs sincerely believe in their cause. But the critical difference is that the New Testament Christian martyrs had more than sincerity. They had evidence that the resurrection was true. Why? Because the New Testament martyrs were eyewitnesses of the resurrected Christ. They knew the resurrection was true and not a lie because they verified it with their own senses. They saw, touched, and ate with the risen Jesus on several occasions, and they had seen him do more than 30 miracles. In light of such strong empirical evidence, they needed very little faith to believe in the resurrection. By common sense observation standards, they had proof of it. So they willingly submitted themselves to persecution and death for what they had verified themselves. This is unlike anything from Islam or any martyr-producing belief system. While the current martyrs for Islam are currently sincere about Islam martyrs are certainly sincere about Islam, they don't have miraculous eyewitness proof that Islam is true. They are not eyewitnesses to anything miraculous. In fact, the contemporaries of Muhammad weren't eyewitnesses to anything miraculous either. When Muhammad was challenged to perform miracles to confirm that he was from God, he never took the challenge. There's references from the Surah to demonstrate that. Instead, he said he was just a man and implied that the Quran authenticated him as a prophet, but there are no clearly defined miracles recorded in the Quran. Miracles were only attributed to Muhammad by Muslims who lived 100 to 200 years after his death because Christians kept asking them for proof that Muhammad was a prophet. These miracle claims are not based on eyewitness testimony and give every indication of being legendary. Several speak of trees moving or saluting Muhammad as he passed by. Mountains and wolves allegedly salute Muhammad as well. And other miracle stories seem to be variations of the miracles Jesus performed, like turning water into milk, feeding 1,000 by multiplying a small meal. These miracle stories are found in the Hadith, a later collection of Muhammad's sayings and doings. The most reliable author of the Hadith, al-Bukhari, and a majority of Muslim scholars admit that most of Muhammad's alleged miracles are not authentic, since Muhammad himself never claimed to do miracles, and since these miracle stories arise from sources well after contemporaries of Muhammad had died, we see no reason to believe any of the miracles attributed to Muhammad. If Muhammad wasn't confirmed by miracles, then why do people follow him? They didn't at first. He and his first few followers were kicked out of Mecca in AD 622, 12 years after he apparently got his first revelation. Since Mecca was a polytheistic city filled with tributes to other gods, Muhammad's message of monotheism was not well received by the local merchants who made their living off the commerce associated with polytheism. It wasn't until Muhammad led successful military conquests between 622 and 630 that he began to attract a large following. His popularity was greatly increased when he led raids on Meccan caravans and divided the booty from those raids with followers. He also took numerous wives, which helped solidify his base of support. In other words, Muhammad's popularity resulted from his lucrative military victories, and he shared with his followers, his astute political dealings, and his personal charisma rather than any miraculous confirmation. The military aspect of Islam highlights another major difference between the origin of Christianity and the origin of Islam. Christianity began as a peaceful faith and was considered illegal for the first 280 years of its existence, during which time it experienced its greatest growth. If you became a Christian in the Roman Empire before about 311, you might be killed for it. By contrast, after a brief but unfaithful attempt to propagate his faith peacefully, Muhammad turned to military force to spread Islam. By 630, he'd seized Mecca by force and had control of much of what is now Saudi Arabian Peninsula. Although Muhammad died in 632, his followers continued military campaigns in the name of Islam. By 638, only 6 years after Muhammad's death, the Muslims had seized the Holy Land by force. In the first 100 years of Islam, in addition to taking Jerusalem, the Muslims twice attempted to take over Constantinople, which is present-day Istanbul, Turkey, and they successfully swept across northern Africa, across the Straits of Gibraltar, and into Europe. Had it not been for Charles Martel, the mayor of the city of Tours, France, all of Europe would probably be speaking Arabic today. Martel, which means hammer, drove the Muslims out of Tours in 732, exactly 100 years after Muhammad's death. The Muslims eventually retreated back over the Straits, but northern Africa remains predominantly Muslim to this day. So here's the contrast. In the early days of Christianity, you might be killed for becoming a Christian. In the early days of Islam's growth, you might be killed for not becoming a Muslim. In other words, the spread of these two great monotheistic faiths couldn't have been more different. Islam spread by use of the sword on others. Christianity spread when others used the sword on it. What about the Crusades, the skeptic will interject. Take a history course. The Crusades did not begin until nearly 1100, more than 1,000 years after the origin of Christianity, and the initial rationale for the Crusades was to take back the land the Muslims previously had seized by military conquest from the Christians. So it was Islam, not Christianity, that initially spread by military crusade. Now, one can understand why a religion spreads when it takes over militarily, but why does a religion spread when its adherents are persecuted, tortured, and killed during its first 280 years? Those are not good selling points. Perhaps there's some more very reliable testimony about miraculous events that proves the religion is true. How else can you explain why scared, scattered, skeptical cowards suddenly become the most dedicated, determined, self-sacrificing, and peaceful missionary force the world's ever known? Now to the summary and conclusion. In the last two chapters, we saw that we have an accurate copy of the early and eyewitness testimony found in the New Testament documents. One central question in this chapter involves invention embellishment, and exaggeration. Namely, did the New Testament writers make up, embellish, or exaggerate the elements of the story? Did the New Testament writers play fast and loose with the facts? No. As we've seen, there are at least 10 good reasons to believe that they were honest men who meticulously and faithfully recorded what they saw. The New Testament writers include numerous embarrassing details about themselves. The New Testament writers include numerous embarrassing details and difficult sayings of Jesus. The New Testament writers include the demanding sayings of Jesus. The New Testament writers carefully distinguish Jesus' words from their own. The New Testament writers include events about the resurrection that they would not have invented. The New Testament writers include at least 30 historically confirmed public figures in their writings. The New Testament writers include divergent details. The New Testament writers challenge their readers to check out verifiable facts, even facts about miracles. The New Testament writers describe miracles like other historical events with simple, unembellished accounts. The New Testament writers abandoned their long-held beliefs and practices, adopted new ones, and did not deny their testimony under persecution or threat of death. So we have all these reasons to support the idea that the New Testament writers relentlessly stuck to the truth. And why shouldn't they? What would motivate them to lie, embellish, or exaggerate anyway? What did they possibly have to gain? They only gained persecution and death for testifying as they did. In other words, the New Testament writers had every motive to deny the New Testament events, not to invent, embellish, or exaggerate them. Again, it wasn't as if they needed a new religion. Just when Jesus arrived, most of the New Testament writers were devout Jews who thought that Judaism was the one true religion and they were God's chosen people. Something dramatic must have happened to jolt them out of their dogmatic slumbers into a new belief system that had promised them nothing but earthly trouble. In light of all this, we don't have enough faith to be skeptics concerning the New Testament. But despite all this evidence against them, the skeptics still have faith. Since the evidence makes it virtually impossible to conclude that Jesus was a legend or that the New Testament writers were liars, some skeptics cling to their only remaining possibility. The New Testament writers were deceived. They sincerely thought Jesus had risen from the dead, but they were wrong. That's the possibility we'll address in the next chapter. Yes, in the next chapter, chapter 12, If I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek, we're going to look at, did Jesus really rise from the dead? So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing the published work, the 30-chapter commentary volume on the book of Psalms, or the volume on the first 30 chapters of the book of Psalms, Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist. Please pray for this ministry. I'd find more subscribers so that we can get the truth of Christianity out to as many people as possible. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.